Hello and welcome to the next in our series of In Conversation With, where we've been exploring in greater depth and more detail collective worship in Church of England schools. And I'm absolutely thrilled today to introduce Margaret Pritchard Houston. Margaret, hello.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, a bit about your background?
Absolutely. Well, I started out as a primary school teacher in London more years ago than I care to admit. And then I moved after that to working as a church-based children's and families worker in a Church of England parish. And now I serve as the Children's Mission Enabler for the Diocese of St. Albans, which is a fancy way of saying I support the work that the churches do with children and families. So I mostly work with the churches, but that does overlap with the schools sometimes in many ways.
Thank you, Margaret. I know you come here with so much wisdom and experience, and I'm absolutely thrilled that you're here with us. And a little bit of context to this in conversation with is that I remember, I think it was September, maybe October, you led this incredible session on an approach to storytelling. And that's something that's really stayed with me. And I kept coming back to it thinking, I bet there's so much that we could use within Church of England schools in drawing upon this approach to collective worship, not least because sometimes there's that trap that we can fall into where we present a biblical text or biblical story, but we often keep it closed and say, by the way, this is the story. Here is the message that we want you to take from it. And storytelling approach keeps it open in such a wonderful way. And particularly in the current time where lots of teachers are perhaps doing class-based worship for the first time, I think this could be something really fascinating and worthwhile for them to think about. So would you mind starting just telling us a little bit more about the storytelling approach?
Yeah, well, we are people of stories. It's what we do every single day. We tell stories. We tell little stories. We tell big stories. We tell stories of what happened to us. We repeat jokes that we've heard. We remember stories that we heard as children, and they stay with us our whole lives. And stories can inform our actions, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are as a person, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are as a community, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are as a nation, can shape our lives and our community's actions and even world events. So I think stories are incredibly powerful, and I think it's really important to give children ownership of stories and to give them to children as a gift. For them to play with and make use of themselves, rather than as something that they need to figure out and sort of determine what the adult wants and then repeat back the lesson that the adult wants them to extract from it. So I like what you said about open versus closed. I think we need to be very open in how we tell stories, especially to children, because they're so important.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And something which really struck a chord with me is this kind of, what's our view of children? What's our conception there? And, I talk about this in terms of RE, but particularly in collective worship, where we're wanting collective worship to be inclusive. We want it to be invitational. We want it to be inspirational. And, after the storytelling session, I had a read of your book, is it Beyond the Children's Corner?
Yes, Beyond the Children's Corner.
Yeah. And you came up with this lovely phrase of, how are we viewing children? Are we viewing them as fellow pilgrims, or are we viewing them as blank slates? And I wonder, could you talk to us a little bit more about what you mean by that in terms of a school context?
Yes, I don't think I coined that phrase. I remember hearing it in various training things that I've been to, so I can't take full credit for that. But as our view of children has developed since sort of the 17th, 18th century, when it was viewed that children came into the world completely empty vessels, blank slates, the tabula rasa, give me a child and 7 years and I can raise them to whatever I want. Entirely, the idea that children are entirely formed by nurture rather than nature. And then that changed throughout much of the 20th century with developmental psychology and children as seedlings who grow along a predictable pattern, and we need to give them what they need in order for them to grow. And then that was tweaked a bit. The big moment for that was the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, where children were viewed as equal citizens with rights of their own. And in churchy language, that would be fellow pilgrims. That basically children are valuable not for who they will become, but for who they are now. That they have just as many rights as adults do, that they are as fully realized and as fully actualized human beings as adults are, still vulnerable and in need of extra protection because of who they are, but with just as many rights as adults. So how that affects us in education, our role is not to fill up this blank slate with all this knowledge that they don't have and we do because we're adults and they're helpless, but to be facilitators of that child's journey and development, to accompany them on the way. And with storytelling, that means we'd be that child is coming to storytelling with their own experiences and their own innate humanity, and their own sort of the software that's loaded on the human brain at birth and how that develops over time. And so they're bringing all of that to the table, and they're making meaning out of the story and understanding the world through the story with their own experiences and their own ideas. And they're developing a sense of how they belong in the world and how they belong in different communities. And in some cases, when we tell religious stories, that's a community building exercise, more in churches than in schools. But for some children, these will be stories that for them, give them a sense of belonging to a particular religious tradition because they claim that story as their own. But our role is not to take all our ideas and our understanding and our experiences and shove them fully made into this child who is empty, but rather to facilitate that child's journey and to accompany them as they make meaning and understanding out of the world, largely through stories.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I think that's so important. Are we seeing, as you said, pupils as empty receptacles to be filled with kind of adult or other views or whatever? Or are we seeing them as agents, forming their own spiritual identity as they explore various things and seeing them as something to say, something to contribute?
Active participants in their own learning. And obviously we will have more experience of the world than a child does. And there will be things that we know that a child does not know. But our role is not to dictate. Our role is to guide and to help that child be an active participant in their own development.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I wonder, are you able to showcase some storytelling for us?
I am, and I'm going to turn this laptop around, so we'll see if I knock anything over. So I'm just going to tell a very, very simple story. One that I think many people, even if they don't regularly attend church, will have heard this story. Not a huge amount happens. I'm not using fancy materials or effects. I'm just using some rocks and a wooden nativity set and 2 boxes covered in fabric. So you don't need a lot of expensive equipment or a lot of digital skills in order to do storytelling. Filled with the Holy Spirit, Jesus went out among God's people to give them new light and new hope, to heal the sick, to raise the dead to new life, to show God's power and love, and to give the people hope. Listen and hear, Jesus said. God is like a shepherd looking for a lost sheep. God is like a woman looking for a lost coin. God is like a father waiting for his son to come home. God is like a king inviting everyone to the wedding feast of God's son. Hear the stories and let them change you. And Jesus chose disciples, his friends and helpers, to be with him, to share his life and his work, to go with him to heal the sick, to raise the dead to new life, to bring good news to the poor, and to show God's power and love. One day, Jesus and his friends had spent the whole day on a mountain in the desert with an enormous crowd of people. They talked and they asked questions and they brought people to be made well by Jesus. And at the end of the day, they were very tired and very hungry. And they were out in the desert, a long way from the town. And Jesus' friends came to him and they said, "What are we going to do? There are thousands of people here and they're hungry and tired. And we're a long way from the town." And Jesus said, "Well, give them something to eat." And Jesus' friends, "We don't have anything to eat. And besides, there are thousands of them. How could we possibly have enough?" And a young child came forward and said, "I have a little bit of food. I have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Give this food to the crowd." And the disciples said, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. How can that possibly be enough? But Jesus took the bread and he blessed it and he broke it. And he gave it to his friends to begin handing out to the people. Some for you, and some for you, and you, and you, and you, and more, and more. They kept giving, and there was enough, and more than enough for them all. And the people who saw it were amazed, and they said, "God is feeding us like he fed our ancestors manna in the desert after they came out of being slaves in Egypt. There is enough and more than enough. Bread from heaven. Now we don't need to be afraid. Now we don't need to fight. There is enough and more than enough. Alleluia. Praise be to God." And the people who were there wondered about what they had seen and what had happened. I wonder what your favorite part of this story was. I wonder what the most important part of this story was. I wonder why the child decided to share their lunch. I wonder what the people felt and thought when they saw the food beginning to be handed out. I wonder what they felt and thought when they realized that there was enough and more than enough. I wonder where you are in this story. I wonder if there are any other Bible stories you've heard that have bread in them. I wonder if there's anything you'd like to make or play with this story. And we can keep wondering throughout the week. But for now, our story is finished.
Thank you, Margaret. I just think it's so powerful, particularly those I wonder questions. Because as you mentioned before, it's everyone's invited to the story. And no matter what age you are, you can still reach those questions. And, if you're in Key Stage 1, you'll meet that story as a Key Stage 1 pupil. If you're 8 years old, you'll meet it as an 8-year-old. If you're 29, you'll meet that as a 29-year-old, So I think that's so lovely. Sorry, Karen.
Absolutely. And the I wonder questions come from the spiritual development program Godly Play, which itself is developed on Montessori principles. So it comes from an educationalist background, and the idea that the child is the leader of their learning. And it's particularly useful for multi-faith environments because there is no one right answer about what that story means. It can be something that has deep religious meaning to you, or it can be a nice story that you're learning about because it's been influential in history and throughout art and literature. So it's not prescriptive. It allows children to have different ideas and different opinions about what that story means.
Definitely. So thinking about schools that might be wanting to explore this in their own practice, are there any top tips that you could offer them? Perhaps it's through your own experience of when I tried this, I found this really worked, or even I found these teething issues which I've come up with stuff, or even those schools which may not have those resources to hand at the moment. Are there ways around that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I would say create a clear beginning and ending. So you're in the story time and then you're out of the story time. And if you need to take some time to get people ready for the story, then take that time. It's worth it, rather than having to stop in the middle and try to control all kinds of different behavior and responses. Make it very clear that questions and ideas and thoughts can be shared freely at the end, but we're going to hear the story as a story, and respect each other as we're listening to it. You might want to do what I did and create a separate story space, or you might want to light a candle, or put on a costume to tell, or something to delineate that story time. Because in a way, stories are magic, and we're going into a magic place that's sort of separate from normal life. The wondering questions are probably one of the best things that I've ever learned in storytelling, because you don't have to do any extra prep. You just have to come up with a list of questions, and children of different personalities and different backgrounds will respond in the way that's right for them. And children don't need to respond out loud. They can respond quietly as well. You thank each child for their answer. Every answer is correct. There's no right or wrong. So children can be encouraged, even if they're scared of getting the answer wrong. Once they start to realize that's impossible here, that can be empowering for them to speak up and share their opinion. So wondering questions are great. And to encourage them to play with the story. So they can do imaginative play with it. When we're able to all meet together, you can play with it in the classroom. The ones who are in your school at the moment, you can encourage them to play with the story, or you can make something at home and show it that plays with the story. Bible stories are special, but they're not untouchable. We don't need to treat them as somehow completely different from all other stories. We play. Well, when I was a kid, we would play Laura Ingalls Wilder, we play Narnia, we play The Secret Garden. So why can't we? And that's how we make meaning out of them. So why can't we play with these stories as well? So providing opportunities to play with the story. So separating your story time as magic time, allowing for wondering, and opportunities for play would be sort of my top 3 tips.
No, that's wonderful. What you were saying about also getting that kind of structure, that clear before time, clear end time, that kind of sense of space and place, that fits really nicely into the GERS model of collective worship, where you gather, you have your engagement section, such as this story, you have your respond through that I wonder questions, and that can be as creative as you'd like, or as simple and reflective as you like. And in that clear sense of, we've had our time of collective worship. What are we going to do now from that? We're doing our spending. So thank you ever so much for sharing your wisdom there, Margaret.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Anything else that you'd like to share?
I would say don't be afraid, because I think there's a lot of fear around collective worship and around Bible stories if you haven't grown up with them yourself, if you're not feeling like you're sort of masterful at the material. So don't be afraid. It's a story. You read stories with your children all the time. You find creative ways of telling stories with your children all the time in literacy and history and all kinds of ways. And this is the same. So you're coming at this just as you would with any other story. And the fact that it's a religious story means it's really important to groups of people as a way of making meaning of the world and their lives. But it doesn't mean that you need to be scared of it. So don't be afraid, be playful and be open.
Thank you. And be yourself.
Yeah.
In the way that you would lead it, facilitate it. And, as those working in schools, we're always reflective. We try something, we think, oh, okay, that went really well in this respect. Next time I can do this a little bit better. So thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.